evening, everyone. I'll let everyone take their seats for now, just so we can get settled. All right. My name is Daniel Bear, and I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Aninilok, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And we are gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Naomi's Houses, a memoir by Rosalie I. Tennison. Many thanks to Heritage House for both publishing this volume and making this evening a reality. Following the reading from Rosalie and a conversation hosted by Don Flaten, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you are one of those here in person today, just raise your hand nice and high for me, and I'll come over to you with this microphone, not to judge you that you're for your volume, it's just for the folks who are watching on the live stream tonight. And I'll be back at the end of the event just to review signing procedure. But for now, your host for the evening, Don Flaten, recently retired from his position as a soil science professor at the University of Manitoba. Early in his career at the U of M, Don was an associate dean and was briefly Rosalie's boss. But despite this experience, Don and Rosalie have remained friends. Don grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan and worked with agricultural communities in all three prairie provinces, so he has a keen appreciation for the rural life in this region. Our featured guest, award-winning agricultural journalist Rosalie I. Tennison, has never forgotten her rural roots. Her long career has taken her from rural weekly newspapers to a small-town radio station to agricultural trade magazines and the communications department of the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. She is the recipient of a gold citation from the Canadian Farm Writers Federation and is a gold medal winner of the 2022 Canadian Online Publishing Award. While she loves meeting producers in the fields where they work, she enjoys returning to the warmth of her Winnipeg condo to curl up with her cat and a good book. Her book, Naomi's Houses, is a woman's poignant account of her impoverished upbringing in isolated rural communities and her mother's struggle to give her children more than she had. Here to read from its pages, please join me in welcoming Rosalie I. Tennison.
Well, good evening, and thank you everyone for coming. A lot of people ask me, how long did it take you to write this memoir? And so I thought I'd give you a little anecdote. And I know I'll hear a gasp from somewhere over there when I say, I'm going to talk about the prologue, because we began referring to it as the dreaded prologue. So when I started writing the book, I thought there has to be some reason why people will be drawn into it and want to know what happened next. So I wrote a prologue, and I tried to do it sort of sensory. So, it was about, bread baking, that kind of thing. And I gave it to two very good friends who are both good writers and readers, and asked their opinion. And one liked it and one didn't. So that's 50-50. That's not good odds if you're trying to get people to buy your book. So I wrote another prologue. And this one, it was still sensory, but I changed it a little bit. It was more tactile. So the cold that I sensed that reminded me of my houses as I was growing up. And I finished writing the book, and I thought I need help. So I started looking for an editor who would help me massage the book into something that you all would like to read. And I found this one, and they usually ask for a sample of your writing. So I sent her the prologue, and she returned it to me completely rewritten. It didn't sound like me, it didn't have the same theme anymore, and I thought, well, that's not good. So I wrote a third prologue and tried to incorporate some of her ideas, and ended up with something that I thought, well, that's pretty good. I eventually did find an editor to help me, and as we were going through the book, she kept asking me questions about the prologue. Like, why did this happen? Could you explain this more? And it kept getting longer and longer until finally I said, this just isn't right. Like, nobody's going to read this, and I don't even like it. And so we decided, well, what can we do? And so I slept on it for a few more nights, and I wrote another prologue. So the fourth prologue. So this is how the process works, folks. And I read it to her over the phone the next day, and she said, I love it. And so that is exactly the prologue that is in the book, except for when Heritage House offered to publish the book, and I started working with their editor, she had a few comments where she said, well, you know, it would be nice if we had a paragraph about this. And so there are about 3 paragraphs that were added, but essentially this is the fourth prologue that I wrote with very few changes. So I've been practicing because I find that it gets quite emotional, and so I hope, you know, bear with me, and I hope I get through it. Life is all about choices. Forced to choose between 2 poor options, Daddy frequently had to pick the alternative that required the least amount of capital. A farmer who watched agricultural innovation change the industry over the years, Daddy's economic situation kept him in the era of the horse. When his neighbors purchased tractors and matching plows, he could only manage the money for a small second-hand tractor. Then he rigged his horse-drawn plow so he could control its function from the tractor via a tripwire and a length of rope to lower the blades into the ground. At his side, Mom stoically managed the house and garden and helped him in the field or in the barn because there was no money to hire farm help. She carefully hand-washed his one good shirt and ironed it to keep it ready for him to wear to church or a funeral. She mended his socks while he repaired his overalls himself using glue and fabric salvaged from pants that couldn't take another patch. Mom said they were a team in all things. They raised their children with firm but loving hands. They never contradicted an instruction or rule set by the other, and disagreements were kept away from our ears and discussed in private. I wish I could ask them how they did it. How did they struggle on year after year on a money-losing farm? Were their minds and spirits bowed under by the weight of debt? When they managed to finish a room in the house or find where the water had seeped in and patched the hole, did they wish they could do better? Did they close their minds to the future in case it looked too bleak to contemplate? I imagine them in our farmhouse during an evening in late November. The sun set several hours ago, the chores are done, and their children are sleeping under quilts and blankets in rooms where the heat from the wood stove doesn't quite reach. The frost on the thin window glass dulls the darkness that surrounds the house. In the glow of the weak overhead light and the firelight glinting through the cracks in the stove, Daddy is sitting on a wooden chair and Mom is placidly rocking. He is reading the paper to get the latest news on the price of grain, which he hopes will be better this year because his wheat crop was good. She is flipping idly through a mail order catalog, hoping the egg money will allow her to buy enough flannelette to make the children new pajamas for Christmas. I'll go to town tomorrow, Daddy says. The cream check should be in. Can you pick up some raisins, Mom asks. If there's money, she adds. He knows she would like to do some baking for Christmas. They don't have a freezer, but the coming December weather will keep her baking frozen in the unheated porch until it is needed. Do you think we can send an order next week? She is looking at a picture of fabric with cowboys on it. Edward would love that. Lynette and Rosalie could have matching flower pattern sets. We'll see. Pete said he paid me for the sow at the beginning of the month. The next day, Daddy arrives home from town with raisins, a pound of bologna, and a chocolate bar the family can share, but no cigarettes. He started smoking in the army, but he always places his family's needs before his habit. He knows the children are already anticipating Christmas. They start talking about Santa Claus as soon as the snow flies. He's also been trying to put aside a dime or two here and there because he'd like to get Mom some Yardley lavender soap for Christmas, the kind he sent her from overseas during the war. Was the check there? She's happy to see the raisins, but feels badly he didn't get a pack of Players. Yes, but I put most of it on the debt at the bank. We're running behind. She watches him run his hand through his wonderful dark wavy hair that is starting to dull with encroaching gray. She cuts his hair and he cuts the children's. She hasn't taken the time to get a haircut in several months. Well, I better get to the chores, he says, heading to the bedroom to change from his one good outfit into his barn clothes. When he comes back into the kitchen, she gives him a hug and a peck on the cheek. She doesn't know what else to do when she sees the creases of worry on his forehead. I am not a witness to their relationship. I may have been sitting on the floor playing with my doll when he got home, and he would have scooped me up in his arms in a big hug after giving Mom the small sack of groceries. He might have taken me with him and let me choose a chocolate bar. While my older siblings were at school, I may have heard many exchanges between my parents, but I don't remember any. I would prefer to imagine them as happy, teasing each other and us, laughing over a story one of their children thought important enough to tell. Our family shelter, the farmhouse, surrounded us in joy and sadness. Never quite finished, but shelter nonetheless. It had a front door no one used because Daddy hadn't found the time or the lumber to build a step to it. Instead, we used the other door that came through the rickety porch where Tippy, our dog, lay keeping watch. The ramshackle building would never be my mother's dream home, but she did the best she could to prevent us getting slivers from the bare wood floor by covering it with hand-woven rugs and cracked linoleum. She kept the wood stove stoked in the hottest summer days so that we would have freshly baked bread and a surprising variety of cookies to take to school in our lunch kits. We eventually left the farmhouse and clustered in the house that I came to refer to as the hovel, while a figurative wolf prowled around the exterior. Still not a dream home, we gained some modern conveniences, such as running water, even where we didn't want it. For respite from the paucity of our homes, we escaped to Wildwood, my maternal grandparents' wonderful property with its solidly built house that came to represent comfort and safety in our jumbled lives. Through the challenges to keep us housed, clothed, and fed, Mom kept a diary detailing all the choices made, from foregoing the purchase of a chair that would be more comfortable than her old rocker to how much she had to shell out to dry clean a threadbare coat. With quiet resignation, she recorded her sadness, but also her joy in her children. Occasionally, she berated the houses she could never make into the one in her dream. As I think about my parents and imagine their struggle, I am also reminded of how often they read to us or played a recording of a symphony on the record player Daddy bought Mom on their honeymoon. Sometimes they took us for walks through the trees on our farm and taught us to identify birdsong or to recognize the tracks of the deer, lynx, and fox that sheltered in the bushes. They excelled at free education that could be found in the natural world, in borrowed books, and lived experience supplied by Daddy's war years and Mom's attendance at high school in Pennsylvania. I am assailed by a memory of Daddy reading the story about the 3 pigs who each live in a different house. Daddy raised pigs, and as a child, I assigned 3 of them parts in the tail. I assumed the pigs were our pigs. The first house is made of straw, which in hindsight fits the profile of our farmhouse. The second, made of sticks, could easily be the hovel. Naturally, the third house would be Wildwood, with its stucco siding taking the place of brick. Of course, the moral is that the brick house saved the animals from the wolf. With the wind whistling through the poorly set windows in the farmhouse, I related to the pigs, and I hoped that someday I would live in a sturdier house. Despite the hard choices and the struggle, Mom and Daddy, like most parents, wanted their children to have a better life. I wish I could tell them I appreciate their hard work and assure them that we did okay. Need a ladder. Okay, Don.
Are you ready for this? Like according to my records, It's been about 35 years since your last performance review. What have you been up to?
Well, I wrote a book.
Oh, well, let's talk about that. Seriously, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I thought it was very interesting, and even though it has sad parts with some of the struggles that you went through, it also has a very hopeful theme through it. Maybe because of the support that you derive from your family, your mother, your dad, and your siblings. So, like I say, I found it thoroughly enjoyable. And of course, it's also well written, which I would know because I hired you to the university. So that didn't come as a surprise. But anyways, and I also connected with it from a more personal perspective, having grown up on a farm myself, but some of the other challenges that you mentioned that we don't think of often nowadays, like no running water.
Oh, I thought you were going to mention the moving from the children's hole in the outhouse to the adult hole in the outhouse.
That's a little bit too personal for me. But I did identify with that. That's quite an emancipation. Yes. But seriously, I did thoroughly enjoy the book, and encourage people here who haven't had the opportunity to read it to do so. But I do have lots of questions that I want to sort of throw your way. And I was thinking maybe we just go through the book word by word. Starting with Naomi. Who's Naomi, and why is it her story, not necessarily your story?
Well, I often read interviews with other writers, and particularly in fiction, where they say, they start out writing one story and a character takes over, and they end up writing the story from a different point of view. And I think that's sort of what happened here. It was my memoir, and I was going to write about it, but the more I wrote about it, Mom kept being part of it. And I realized I wouldn't be here without her. And so Naomi's my mother, and she, I think, I feel pretty blessed. I had a really good mother, and she worked very hard. Mm-hmm. So that's why it ended up not being about me. It's supposed to be about me, right? But it wasn't. It is more about my mother and how I watched her with her struggles, and how ultimately they shaped me today.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I've got to get to the second word. Houses. And I was just curious as to why you selected houses for the title as opposed to homes, which is a little bit different word. And I know that you're very careful with your words. You're a professional writer. Why did you pick houses instead of homes?
Well, houses, I feel, are just structures. There's somebody here from the Architecture Foundation, and she may correct me on this, but I just think of houses as being just buildings, whereas homes are where you spend your time with your family. It's what shapes you, and it's what makes you ultimately who you are. And so for my mother, she always wanted us to have wonderful homes, right, but she didn't get the structure to make them into wonderful homes. She always wanted to have lots of bookcases because we had lots of books, but she never got that. And so really the houses were just sort of the structure that kept us together, as opposed to homes where we've always felt comfortable, because some of these places weren't that comfortable. When we had to come home late at night and the wood stove had got out and it's cold, and whereas so they were just buildings, and so that's why she never had the home of her dreams.
Yeah, I can see that, but I can also appreciate that what your mother invested for the benefit of her family in the home environment was tremendous. And it's a great tribute to her in that respect. Now, a little bit, maybe an awkward question is, why did you write the book? Like, what motivated you?
Well, I always knew from the time I understood what those little black squiggles are on paper that I loved reading, and I wanted to learn how to write. And so I always thought I would write a book. And you know, I've got a shoebox full of unpublished short stories, I've got a half-finished novel that will go nowhere. But I always kind of had an idea that maybe someday a memoir would be good, because I think I do have a really interesting family. And it wasn't really until I moved home from Ontario to Winnipeg and started shopping for what I eventually bought, which was a condo, that it started to gel in about like why I picked the condo I picked. And then it just started to come together until one day I, you know, said to one of my friends, I'm gonna write a book. And she went, yeah, okay, sure. And I did, and here we are.
Well, and that's interesting because you talk about your lifelong passion for reading and writing, and that led you, I assume, to doing a degree in English literature and history at Carleton, and you spent quite a few years as a professional writer. What sort of motivates or rewards that passion? Is it more the story, or is it how it's told, or both? Like there's a craft associated with telling the story, and then there's the story itself. Is one of those dominant, or are they equal?
I think it depends on the style of writing. You know, like I mostly work as a journalist, which is pretty cut and dried. You know, it's just the facts, and there isn't a lot of room for creativity. But there is a certain amount of challenge in that, to get to say in a very short space your story, like to get the story across. And when I worked in radio, we had, you know, a half a page was 45 seconds. Like you had to tell the whole story in 45 seconds. So there's that challenge. But then when you get into the creative side, which this was, I had a hard time learning how to switch gears to write in a more, I would say, a more reader-friendly way. And so I started, the first draft was very much a sort of a journalistic piece.
Okay.
You know, it was just the facts, this happened, then that happened. And it wasn't until I started working with editors that they said, no, you really have to insert yourself into the story, and you have to, because otherwise people really don't care. You know, they don't care about you. And so I found that was a whole new style of learning to write, of putting myself into the story versus the journalistic side, which is, you know, the bare facts. So I can't say I like one more than the other. I didn't have much experience with the one as opposed to the other, but they're both two different things, and they're both fun to do.
Can you give us an example of that process of transforming what you might have started off with as just the facts, and then transforming it into a more personal and compelling, engaging story?
Well, I think my little anecdote about the prologue is one, because I mean, in another meeting or whatever, I'm actually going to read the first prologue, and I think people would see that the huge difference, because the first one, it is very factual, you know, because I said I was trying to make it sensory, but it was like, you know, about, you know, the smell of bread baking, and then I move on to something else. Like it was just like, you know, this happened and this happened, and there wasn't that sort of warmth that I think is in the one that I read. You know, it was a much colder, and maybe that's why, you know, my one friend didn't like it. It was just too stark, or it wasn't engaging enough. Whereas this prologue, I think, is much, it's a little bit more imaginative, and it gives you more of a stronger sense of the people and the life they were leading. Whereas the first one, I don't think did.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because I wouldn't necessarily be a good person to evaluate that, because you and I have been friends for a long time, and even if you had written it in a journalistic style, I would have been personally engaged, just because we've had 35 years of friendship, right?
Yeah.
But to engage a new reader, or a reader that doesn't know you, and still sort of get them engaged on a more personal level, I think that's a much different style of writing, and I can appreciate that. What about reading the book? Why should somebody else read it? What about somebody who's not your friend? Like,
You mean somebody
almost
that-
everybody here is a friend of yours. Is there anybody here who's not a friend of yours? Why should they read it?
Well, I think it depends, and I had to go through this when I was searching for a publisher too. They quite often ask a question like that: who is your audience?
Yeah.
And so I felt that my audience would be people like me or us, baby boomers, maybe who grew up with in a rural lifestyle. It doesn't matter where in Canada. There's certain similarities, and chances are there are parts of this story that you will relate to, as you did, even though you're from Saskatchewan, I'm from Manitoba, and I have a friend that's from the East Coast that I think also would relate, because like, it's a story about a poor family, and poverty doesn't play favorites. You can be poor anywhere. So therefore, I think anybody that doesn't know me might find it interesting if they had sort of a similar experience of growing up either rurally or knew somebody who had grown up in a rural area, maybe the whole wood stove, the no running water. That you have to keep in mind that this book is only some of the events in it are only 50 years old. That's not a long time. I was telling somebody earlier that, I moved to Brandon in the 80s, and it was the first time I had an apartment that had a phone jack, because up until then, phones were wired into the wall.
I thought you were going to say you had a cell phone. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Anyway, I just feel that anybody who grew up through that period in the 60s and 70s when the whole social history of Canada was changing, we were becoming more progressive. There was a little bit more money around, but agriculture was changing, maybe becoming a little bit more progressive, and there was a bit more money to be made in it, that they could relate to a lot of the incidents in it.
But I think that there's also some other broader, more universal themes going beyond poverty, and thinking about family relationships, and growing up, the parts that you looked into your sort of, what do they call it? The tween years, like going to junior high and not feeling as if you fit in. I think probably most of us have felt at various stages of our lives that we just didn't fit in. Or maybe I'm the only guy. Didn't fit in. And my colleagues who know me, just shut up. No, but are there some universal themes that you think have additional appeal to the reader?
Well, I mean, I think, we hear about it in the news all the time. That, I think it's probably worse now than when I was growing up, but the whole issue of bullying. Right. I was bullied in school, but you see, if I could outrun the bullies, I was safe. Now they call you on your cell phone, and I think it's more difficult for children. But certainly some of these things, they've always been with us. Like they aren't changing. We aren't seeming to get to a kinder, gentler place in our world. And so that's growing up and having to deal with those kind of things. And I was very fortunate in that I did have a mother who was like, oh well, sticks and stones and all that kind of stuff, and they don't matter, they're ignorant, and she sort of propped me up to the point where I could go to school the next day knowing that I was likely going to be chased home or whatever next torture that they could come up with for me. So I don't think that's that isn't, again, this takes place 50 years ago, but it's still happening today.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few of those universal themes. Now, a little bit about method. It's more about method. Now, there's a lot of detail in this book, and for those of us that love detail, and I do, I enjoyed all that stuff. But where did you get this? All from your head? Or did Lynette fill in all the gaps?
Well, I do have to say that my siblings did help quite a bit.
Okay,
You know, Lynette is older than I am, so of course she has, you know, more mature viewpoints of some of the
she's
things.
smarter than you. Well, no.
Well, I'd like to say she's bigger than I am, but we put that to bed a long time ago.
Okay.
She's now the older sister and the younger sister versus the big sister and the little sister.
Okay.
But our brother was really super. He loved the farm. He missed farming. He spent 30 years of his life in Thompson as a miner, but always missed the farm. And so he was 15 years old when we left the farm. He had every expectation that he was going to be farming, and then that all fell apart. So he was great. It was something he wasn't well when I was writing, and so it gave us something to talk about. I could phone him and say, hey, you know, what about all these uncapped wells on the farm? You know, like why were we always being told to avoid the uncapped wells? You know, why didn't they cap the darn things? You know, well, because they expected the children to stay away from them if they were told to, right? And so he was invaluable in helping me with some of the detail. And then, of course, my mother's diaries.
So she's actually a co-author.
Yes, you could say that, because I used a lot of her diaries. I read them all, and then I used, for those of you who haven't looked at the book, I start each chapter in the book with some diary entries that kind of follow the theme of whatever the chapter's going to be. So those were all real. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you know, my mother didn't swear or anything like that, but if she was upset, you could tell by the way she wrote whatever she wrote that, you know, she wasn't happy. And so I did draw a lot on her, and we spent most of our time together from the time, you know, my siblings left home and my mother and I were, you know, home alone together. You know, she talked to me a lot.
Right.
And so, and she was also somebody who thought that everybody should have a good memory. And so she was always, you know, she'd send me to the grocery store with the list in my head. I had to memorize it. And, you know, so I would, you know, so consequently, I think that training of having to always be remembering things, when she told me things, I remembered them. And, you know, all these years later, they kind of spewed out onto the page.
Well, I'm amazed at how much you remember. That's incredible. But when you were doing that research, you probably uncovered some new things, or maybe even when you started searching back in your memories, you remembered something new and different that was a powerful sort of experience to come across. Can you give us an example of something that gave you new insight or a new perspective that you hadn't really thought of before?
You know,
Before you started writing this memoir? Like I would think that the process of writing that memoir would reveal things that you hadn't thought of before.
well, I think one of the things about writing it, and I've been asked sort of this before, is, you know, why did you wait till now to write it? Like, why didn't you write it, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And I think the reality is that in order to write this kind of a memoir, you need time, you need the distance of, you know, it isn't an anger, like there's anger in it, but it isn't directed at my mother. And so I think as time went on and I became more mature, and don't argue with that, I had more sensitivity to understand what she was going through.
Right.
And so as I was writing some of these stories and was drawing on her diaries, it brought home to me like, oh, that's what that was about, or oh, that's what was going on, because as a child, I didn't necessarily understand. And I went through, you know, there's stories that are, you know, to use the film analogy, that are laying on the cutting room floor because in the end they didn't quite fit into the book. And there's other stories that I wish I could have found a way to work them in, because I think it, you know, again, it showed that sort of universality of society. And so I think that was the thing, is like looking back and thinking, where was I and what was I doing at the age that she was dealing with some of the things that she was dealing with? And that I think was and for me was very eye-opening. And I think that's hopefully a healthy thing, to not blame her, but to realize that, man, she was dealing with some really hard life challenges.
Right. And was there any one of those particular anecdotes or events that you think was especially important for building your own character? Because I think that, I mean, the fact that you're here today as a successful journalist and author is a tribute to your mom and the rest of your family and the people that have supported you, and also to your own character. Is there anything in the book that you would regard as sort of like a pivotal event or something like that that really made a difference to your development as a person? I know this is heavy stuff.
Yeah, no, I think the largest one was watching her struggle and not succeed. She, applied for so many jobs and was never given the job. And there was an awful lot of, now you couldn't get away with it. Telling her she was too old at 46 to do the job. And I think I absorbed that to the point where I knew that I had to get an education. I mean, she wanted me to have one, but I knew that without it, I was going to be her.
Right.
I was going to be, not being able to find a job. And I saw her struggle trying to raise 3 children and not have any money. And I knew that whatever job I had to do, I chose, was going to have to pay me enough that if I had to, I could support a family. So I think that's the biggest one, is that I watched her work so hard to get us ahead. And I determined that was what was necessary. That's how you get on in the world.
Yeah, and I think that there's lessons for us, all of us, in that. Perseverance is a word that comes up, when people talk about your book. Something completely different, the photographs. There's a few photographs in the book, not as many as I would like. I'd like to meet all these people, all these characters in your book. But how did you select the photographs to include in your book? And do you have a favorite that's particularly heartwarming? Or?
Well, it turns out, you asked me this before, and it turns out we have the same favorite, and a number of people I've asked, and they all have the same one. So I guess I didn't need the rest, because there's only one that was necessary. And that's the picture of me with my brother.
Your big brother.
My big brother. And his spanking new cherry red Parisienne. Yeah. So you like that?
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's really neat about that, there's an obvious admiration and love between the two of you, and it's a pretty cool picture. I like that one too.
But the difficulty was when I originally wrote the book, I never anticipated ever, like I wasn't going to have pictures in it. You don't have to. But then people would say, "Well, are you going to have pictures?" And I didn't know, and we didn't really have pictures. And when it came down to it, it's a story about a family, of course, but when I'm writing about the houses and trying to describe them, you think, well, I'd like to see a picture of that house. Well, why would you have a picture of a house you hate? So there really aren't pictures of these houses that we lived in. There's like a corner of one that's and so the nicest house, of course, is the one of my grandparents, and it's beautifully taken, the garden around it, and I mean you can tell they're really proud of that house, whereas the other ones not so much. So it came down to trying to curate what photos we had that would kind of give people an idea of who this family was.
Right, and on a completely different topic, but somewhat related to an earlier comment that you made, you worked as an agricultural journalist for 35 years or more, and you've seen a lot of changes in agriculture. There's this little agricultural theme sort of running through the book as well. It seems to me that agriculture and advances in agricultural technology have made quite a difference, not only to agriculture, but to farm families and communities. Any comments about what you see in your home community of the Swan River Valley back then to what you see now, or about agriculture in general and its influence on the sense of rural communities?
Well, I can draw in my brother on this one. You know, when we were growing up on the farm, my dad was a veteran, and you know, they'd come through the 30s. You know, they were encouraged to put up shelter belts, and so there was all these shelter belts, and every quarter section had a house on it. You knew who lived in those houses, and so my brother, you know, would go visit our family there. And one time he phoned me and he said, "You wouldn't recognize it now."
Mhm.
And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You know what? They've taken out all the shelter belts." He said, "You can see all the way from our grandfather's farm, which was the one I call Wildwood in the book, to the new inland grain terminal, which is 5 miles out of Swan River." So that's like 15 miles that you can see. And there's not a tree, there's nothing, because it's now they farm like full sections of land.
Right.
And there's not these little fields, like even our farm, I shake my head when I think about the sloughs that were on it and the, you know, the trees. And I go back and the entire quarter section is cleared except for where the house was. And I don't know, maybe that's because there's so many uncapped wells there. They're afraid they're gonna lose the tractor, which I think you have experience with.
We can talk about that. We'll talk soil science later. No, but I think there's quite an impact on the rural communities as well, because you mentioned this in your book too, about how life and community used to revolve around the community schools, these one-room schoolhouses, and that's just not happening anymore. And so I don't think that there's the same sense of community as well. It goes along with this, you know, expanding size of farms. Right?
Well, and I think too, you know, in our case, I mean, you're right, like the rural communities, they banded together. And like when my father died, of course, all our neighbors pitched in and they, you know, they helped us. We didn't have things like food banks, and like, you know, without those people coming and helping us, who knows how we would have fared, right?
Right.
So it has changed a lot. We have a lot more, you know, social safety nets, and I think that's great.
Yeah.
They weren't really there for us, but we did live in a rural community, and you know, like somebody, you know, grandpa would come in and bring us a half a cabbage, or you know, like, and you know, friends would come. Well, our uncles were hunters, so you know, we'd get you know, a roast of moose meat or something,
Mhm.
which was a nice change from, you know, the occasional hot dogs or whatever that we had. So I think it really has changed, and yet back to my point about it isn't that long ago. You know,
Yeah.
It isn't that long ago that all this started happening, you know, to the point where, you know, like, can you imagine having a tractor that's designed, or a plow that's designed for horses, and trying to, you know, make it work with a tractor because you couldn't afford to buy the plow that went with the tractor.
Like you said, though, the horse-drawn plow, the horse knew when to stop at the end of the field. Like it was sort of like the first version of auto steer.
Exactly. The horses always stopped at the end of the field.
We've got to wrap it up here,
Yes.
but one last question, and if you're comfortable, you can answer it. Of course, the main character in this story is your mom. And what do you think your mom would think of your book? Would she pat you on the head and just say, "That's nice, Rosalie"?
Yeah,
or
they're there,
what?
yeah.
Yeah, they're there.
No, actually, I think my mom would be very proud. I think she'd be busting her buttons with pride, because I told her I was going to write a book, and I did it, and so she would be, you know, quite pleased. I think she would be secretly, because she didn't believe in conceit. Like, she never ever told us we did a good job. So she would be, but she would secretly be very pleased that her name is in the title.
Right.
Having said all that, I think she'd be very annoyed with me because she wouldn't probably have appreciated how the stories that I tell that show how resilient she was,
Right.
were, she would be embarrassed that I had shared them, which is why I could never have written this book until, you know, she wasn't with us.
Right.
So yes, she'd have been happy and also annoyed.
Now
Did you
Rosalie.
have to say that, dear? I liked it up until you mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're supposed to open things up for the floor. So Daniel, are you gonna run around with the microphone?
Essentially, yeah.
If he has one that works, yes.
He probably doesn't even know who Phil Donahue is.
Not well, no.
Okay, does anybody have a question for Rosalie?
Well, they all know me so well, they probably go, yeah, we've heard it.
Can you talk about the hardest part of the editing process?
The hardest part of the knitting process?
Editing.
Of the editing, I thought, how does she
Kinda like
know I
knitting.
did
Kinda
that?
You could talk about knitting or quilting or any of those other things too.
I would think, how did she know that I knit? I think the hardest part is accepting that you aren't the brilliant writer that you think you are. I'll pay you later. I knew that because I do read a lot, and sometimes you read a book and you think, man, that they could have used an editor. We've all probably read one of those. And so I knew that even though I had written this book, that it probably needed more help than what I could give it. So I actually sought out an editor to help me with the structure and help me, do the stories and things like that, which ultimately I think is what made it maybe more attractive to a publisher. Because they felt that it was already a fairly well-formed book that they didn't, and we basically didn't do a lot of editing at the publishing stage. It was more like copy editing and are you sure you wanted to use this word and that kind of stuff. So I think having an editor and accepting that they know what they're doing is the important part. Like not arguing with them all the time about no, I'm brilliant. Why are you saying that I can't write that? So I think that's the main thing is being able to not take it personally and understand their advice, because they probably are really making it better for you. Uh-oh. No, the foreign journalists are starting to ask questions.
That was great information about the editing process. So before you got the editor and when you were first sitting down to write, what was like your process? Did you plot out how you want to tell the story? Did it start with your mom's journals, or where did you really decide how you were gonna write what you did?
Well, when I decided that I was going to use the houses as a hook, then I started, I didn't write anything down. I was just thinking about it. I do a lot of my best thinking when I'm driving, and I don't listen to the radio or anything. I just think, and a lot of times I write in my head. And so I was formulating how the condo that I purchased and why I chose what I did in relation to those houses. So I started thinking about that and how they would fit together, and then wondering what my mother's attitude was to what I was thinking about. So I sort of did a little bit of, I guess you could almost call it mental research. But once I started writing, I just hammer it out. I do that even with the stuff I've written for you. Is I just I get what the title is, and then I just start writing. Now that doesn't mean I don't change it and I go back, but I tend to just dive down and write. I don't like I have a friend who wrote a couple of novels, and one time I visited her and she had this wall and it was stuck with Post-it notes, and she says, "This is how you plot a book." And I went, wow, that's not how I plot one. I just write and get it down, and then go back and I mean, the old days of newspaper work where you actually had to cut and paste, I did a lot of that, but with a computer. It looks like you're gonna have to use your follow-up question.
Oh, there's a question at the back.
Oh, saved.
Saved.
what do you hope, what are some of the things that you have imagined about the impact of the book? Like in your heart of hearts, how do you want this book to impact the readers?
I hope that they are impressed by my mother. I tell people this is a story about an ordinary family who ended up having some unexpected challenges in their life. And, you know, I mean, if this was a novel, I could, like my mother character could have reacted in so many different ways to what the story is and what she did do. But I think it's very uplifting that she just sort of put her head down and focused on making sure that her children did better. And that she did it without, you know, all the trauma and the dramas that we hear about, so many, you know, like alcoholism or whatever. No, she just, you know, just decided that this was her job and that's what she had to focus on. And I think that's a really good example to how you can get things through life and help people around you. Oh no, you've opened the floodgates, Erin.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed the little bit that I've heard and read so far. As a person that loves to write journals, I'm very curious and impressed with your mother's journaling. How did these journals come to you? In what form? What did she write on?
She wrote my mother was a doodler, so we have scraps of paper with all sorts of stuff on it. But for her actual diaries, she filled countless Kilroy notebooks, and she had beautiful writing. But because we didn't have a lot of money and she wasn't going to spend money on, you know, even though they probably only cost 10 cents, she would put 2 lines of writing for each line in the Kilroy. And she wrote from the edge of the page to the edge of the page on all 4 sides. So when you hold it up, it's just this, you know, blue or whatever scribbles. So they were very hard to read, you know. I mean, her writing was beautiful, but they were like, it's just this cramped writing. And my brother used to laugh. He'd say, "Oh, I got a letter from Mom," and I'd say, "Oh yeah, you know what's she doing?" He says, "I don't know. She won't use an extra piece of paper." So she'd take 2 sheets of paper and she'd write edge to edge on 4 sides and then sign it, you know, "Love, Mom," and then realize, oh, I meant to tell him, you know, that his cousin, you know, bought a new horse or something. And so she'd squeeze it in up the side. Like she wouldn't get another sheet of paper to put 1 line on it, or, you know, a half a line. And so we have all these, you know, letters that, you know, she had and we kept. And yeah, they're all these, like, it's tight. You almost need a magnifying glass and you probably go cross-eyed if you were to read them for, you know, a very long period of time. What I did was I went through them, and when I saw a quotation, like I don't know how you'd mark it, you know. So what I did was I just was reading them. When I found a quotation I thought was particularly poignant, I'd run to my computer and type it out, you know, because I knew I'd never find it again if I had to go back and look.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really excited to read it. And in your reading, I definitely heard things that I remember in my childhood, like growing up with a wood stove. So I think there's things that touch people, you know, no matter what you, like you said, there's always going to be things that touch you. My question is, now that you've written a book, what's next? Are you going to continue with memoirs, like experiences with a certain soil scientist? Or are you gonna dabble?
Rosalie's bosses.
Yes. I think that's a whole series.
And I can think of two right off the bat that we all worked for.
Or will you dabble in fiction?
I don't know. I do actually have an idea for another memoir, a different style of memoir. And I've actually started writing it, but I don't know. This has been 5 years out of my life, and freelancing in between. And yeah, I think I need to sort of enjoy this ride, and then see if I have the energy to do another 5 years for another book. Of course, if it becomes this huge bestseller, because you're all going to buy several copies tonight, then the publisher will just want me to write another book, right?
So I guess we're supposed to wrap this up. 30 seconds, maybe you have any last words you want to share?
This is about the signing. I see there's quite a few members of my St. Luke's family here. And if you're buying the book and you'd like it signed, bring it to church on Sunday if you don't want to stand in line. I have. Listen, babe. So if you don't want to stand in line, I'll do that on Sunday. I'll just throw that out there.
Awesome. Here we go. Well, thank you both so much, Rosalie and Don. We are now going to move on to the signing portion. So again, too, feel free to approach the signing table over here and have your book signed now or after you pay. That's up to you. So long as you pay, everything's. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us here and online. To Heritage House, to Don Flaten for gracefully steering the conversation, and of course, to Rosalie I. Tennison. Thank you.